John Gavloski, who I've mentioned several times already. He is speaking on old pests, new pests, and heaps of hoppers, insect concerns from 2021 and forecast for 2022. He is our resident entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, based out of Carman. And actually, he's just down the hall. So if he says something wrong, I'm going to go and beat him up. He conducts monitoring programs for some of Manitoba's major insect pests and provides information on insects, both beneficial and potential pests to farmers, agronomists, and those working in agriculture. He does about a bajillion presentations and information updates for agronomists and farmers, co-produces a weekly Manitoba crop pest update during the spring and summer, and he's been with Manitoba Agriculture since 1997, and yet he doesn't look old enough for that. He has a bachelor's degree in environmental biology and a master's in entomology from the University of Guelph. His PhD was the Department of Entomology at the University of Manitoba. And aside from entomology, he enjoys cycling and observing almost any type of wildlife and trying to convince me to eat flavored grasshoppers. That being said, John will be doing a quiz, or he has 3 questions during his presentation. I will be monitoring the chat for those answers. So use the chat function to answer those questions. John, take it away.
Thanks, Tammy. And just a note of correction here. It's flavored crickets that I'm trying to
did I say grasshoppers again?
You said grasshoppers, very different critters, but yeah, the smoky barbecue crickets are awesome. I recommend them.
I didn't taste a flavor.
So anyway, Elizabeth's presentation and the questions that came from it are actually a really good lead into mine, because a few of the things that came up we'll be addressing here, which is really cool. And so what I'm going to be talking about is basically the top insect concerns from 2021 and, where we can, a forecast from 2022. Now, given that I'll be doing this in 40 minutes instead of the half day that I requested, I will limit my list to our top 6 insects. And in addition to our top 6 insect concerns, we'll be looking at some newer pests in the province, a couple that are expanding their range, and also one that is completely new to Manitoba that I think people should start taking quite seriously. And as Tammy mentioned, we do have some skill testing questions with prizes. And there'll be 3 of these. When the question comes up, it'll be in a black box with red letters like this. Your prizes will be either a Pest and Predators Field Guide, a really cool book that talks about not only the pest insects, but the things that eat them. Or if you already have one of those and you want, you could win a Field Heroes t-shirt. Oh, by the way, we also had planned on doing an all expenses paid trip to Hawaii as a 3rd prize option, but I was told because of a certain COVID variant going around that we'll have to forfeit that for this year. But regardless, you've got a couple really cool prizes here, so pay attention and hopefully you do get on the quiz. So the 6 insects I'll be covering are these mentioned here. The top 2, flea beetles and grasshoppers, I've got them separated from the pack, and that's for a reason. They were major insect concerns over the past season. When I say major, I mean they were issues not just sporadically or in localized areas, more widespread across the province. And they were things that many farmers and agronomists had to deal with. The others were more localized. Diamondback Moth, Alfalfa Weevil, more of an eastern concern. And we had aphids and small grains, they blow in. You'll find out where they became an issue. And I'll start with flea beetles, because that was probably our biggest concern. My slide I'm using here is almost identical to the one I used last year when I did similar updates. All the canolas treated with a neonic, yet people were having to do foliar insecticide applications. I'm aware of some growers doing up to 4 foliar insecticide applications on top of the neonic seed treatment. So something wasn't working well this year. We'll get into what that might have been. In addition, there was quite a bit of reseeding that had to be done for flea beetles. So I had quite a few people telling me that reseeding was happening in their area. Now, a big part of flea beetles is getting the plants to the 3 to 4 leaf stage within about 3 to 4 weeks of seeding date, not when the plants come out of the ground, but seeding date. That's really the critical challenge. And if you can do that, you probably won't need to be doing foliar sprays. Problem is when you get a year like this that had challenging environmental conditions, it's a tough thing to do. And people were trying to do all the right things, adjusting their seeding dates and trying to wait till there was a bit of moisture in the soil. But regardless, people were seeding, the seed was sitting there, and when the plants did come up, the plants seemed to be trapped in that vulnerable cotyledon and first leaf stages for an extended period of time. In the meantime, the neonics were wearing out, flea beetles were feeding like crazy, and people were doing foliar spraying. So that's the reality of what happened. Now, what you can do to alleviate that, I mentioned some people were adjusting seeding dates, the thinking being that if we, in most situations, people seed their cereals first, their canola second, maybe their soybeans next. I know of situations where people were seeding their soybeans prior to their canola to try to, because soybeans, you can go a little bit deeper apparently, and they're trying to wait until there was better soil moisture before they put their canola into the ground to get that quick start so that hopefully they wouldn't have to be doing foliar spraying. So people were doing all the right things. But even when you do that, you can get years like this where it's still not quite enough because it's just taking too long for the canola to get to that 3 to 4 leaf stage. There's been a few studies that have looked at seeding dates and flea beetle damage, and generally it can work well. The first study I've listed here by Lamb in 1984, that they found that their earlier seeded tests suffered more damage by flea beetles, seeding a bit later, less damage. A study by Jan Canola in North Dakota, a bit more recently, basically verified that. And a study by Hector Carcamo in Alberta, they got mixed results depending on where they did the study. But one thing, again, to emphasize, what really matters is getting the plants to the 3 to 4 leaf stage in 3 to 4 weeks. Whatever you can do to hopefully try to accomplish that is going to help. And in some years, seeding date may do it, and some years it may not. It depends on the conditions. So an interesting situation here. We had a field of canola being, I'll say, heavily damaged by flea beetles, and it had to be sprayed, foliar spray. Right across the road is a wheat field, and the wheat has started to come up, but it's just full of volunteer canola. And what the farmer noticed was that there's absolutely no flea beetle damage to that volunteer canola, which of course is at this point untreated. Yet across the road, his neonic treated canola, he's now doing a foliar spray on. So his question to me was, why? Why are they not feeding on this volunteer canola in the wheat? Why are they across the road feeding on my canola that I want to keep? And hard to know for sure what's going on there, but what I suspect is the crop residue, the wheat, and the residue that was present in that wheat field may have been creating a microclimate that the flea beetles didn't like, or at least didn't like as much. So they were all across the road where there was a better microclimate for them. And there's been a few studies that have looked at this, I guess I'll call it a trend, where you get less damage in canola in zero-till situations. I've listed a few of them here. The first one is a Manitoba study, and we've got a North Dakota study in there. The last one is being done in Sweden, where they're having some real issues with flea beetles as well, and trying to figure out cultural controls that might help. So they're looking at that as well. But bottom line, flea beetles are picky. They do prefer certain environments over others, and they do seem to prefer the more open environments that they get a lot of canola fields over situations where there is a bit of trash stubble or other crop. So that kind of ties in a bit with what Elizabeth was talking about. The other thing before I move on from flea beetles is regarding populations late in the season. There were a fair amount of people that were spraying their canola in August for the late summer population of flea beetles that was feeding on the pods. And this at times can be an issue. There's only been one study that's really looked at the economics of it. They were trying to develop an economic threshold, a late season economic threshold for flea beetles on canola. They never really did provide a threshold because even at their highest levels, they weren't really getting economic damage. So their conclusion was that even when you've got seeds that are translucent to green, numbers higher than about 100 flea beetles per plant, and for some cultivars, higher than 350 per plant would be necessary to cause significant yield reductions. So really, this is an area that probably needs a bit more work. It's very, very good study. It gives us some guidelines, but we did see some situations this year where the pods, that, particularly around the field edges, were really being heavily damaged by flea beetles. And people were foliar spraying, and rightly so, because again, this study tries to provide some guidance, but you have to use your thresholds are an art and a science. And sometimes when you don't have data that gives you the answers you need, you have to use your gut feelings on things. So there was, again, a fair amount of foliar spraying late in the summer for flea beetles. Now, what to expect for next year? Tammy alluded to it. Flea beetles don't really hang out within the field too much. Over the winter, they tend to go to more sheltered areas to overwinter. They like to crawl underneath some leaf litter or debris. Often it's in an area with some trees or shrubs. And we usually get quite good winter survival here. So bottom line, don't count on high winter kill. Expect flea beetles next spring. And I think how much damage occurs will probably be due to weather events and whether or not we get conditions where you can get your canola from seeding to 3 to 4 leaf stage in 3 weeks. That's what it'll likely boil down to. But on the flea beetle end of it, based on what we've seen the past several years, recent trends, I would almost anticipate the flea beetles to be back again. And before I move on to grasshoppers, I just want to point out we've got some really good young researchers in Manitoba doing some really interesting studies looking at flea beetle biology and some of the things that eat flea beetles. And this is a study, I just wanted to draw some people's attention, a study by Shayla Storozak at the University of Manitoba. And Shayla has been studying predators of flea beetles, things that could eat them, and some of the other effects other than direct consumption. Now, the predators that she's showing here, some of them will directly consume flea beetles, like these ground beetles here, and this wolf spider, Parosa. The level they consume is probably insignificant. So don't count on there being huge consumption by predators. However, having them running around on the soil is doing more than just that direct consumption. It seems that you get less stem feeding when you have lots of predators running around. The flea beetles seem to be a bit, what we're anticipating is happening is that the flea beetles are a bit more skittish. They're not hanging around in the same area as much. So you don't get the same large feeding pits in the stems when you have a lot of predators running around. So that's interesting research. And it goes to show that beyond direct consumption, predators do have other indirect effects on their potential prey. Okay, so we're going to move into grasshoppers. And we did have some very heavy populations this year. There was a fair amount of insecticide that had to be used, some of it just around field edges early in the season, which is something we recommend. In other cases, it was whole fields being sprayed. And our dominant species this year were two-striped grasshopper and another species that almost looks like it has 2 stripes, but isn't. So question 1 for our awesome prizes is, what is this species? So Tammy, if you can let me know when we have a winner, I will put the answer up.
Oh, Derek Penner got it.
Oh, okay, very good, Derek. So this is clear-winged grasshopper, which again, it almost looks like it has two stripes as well. And one thing you'll notice, it has these black spots on the wings. So not really clear wings, so not really an appropriately named grasshopper. It is smaller than the two-striped, and its diet is different. It's more of a grass specialist. So sometimes it's good to know what species you're dealing with when you're trying to decide on appropriate management techniques for grasshoppers. Okay, another situation here. I had two calls from agronomists in July, and in both cases, they had very high levels of grasshoppers in a canola field directly across from a pasture. But the grasshoppers weren't really causing a lot of damage to the canola. So their question to me was, what's going on here? Should we be controlling them? There's a lot in there, but we don't see a lot of feeding. Do we wait for them to start feeding and then control them? What do we do? And I think they had a suspicion that this might not be a species that is particularly damaging to canola, because in both cases, they did not spray the field. And in both cases, the grasshoppers moved on after a period of time. It was clear-winged grasshopper that was moving in. So what happened in these instances, the pastures were drying down. The grasshoppers had been feeding in there as well. And the grasses that they were feeding on were much less abundant. So they were moving, looking for other grasses to feed on. They moved into the canola field. It was the nearest thing to the pasture. Wasn't a good host, so they, in short time, moved along. So bottom line there is good to know your grasshoppers. Some of them are picky in what they're going to feed on, and it's good to know the picky ones from the ones that really don't care what they're eating as much. Another thing that a couple people commented on this year was that they were using this strip application on some of their field crops. Now, this is something that was researched in Wyoming on pastures, and it was shown to work really good there. You're treating a strip, leaving a strip, treating a strip, leaving a strip. And it definitely is the most economical way to grasshopper control in pastures. I did have people saying that they were using it in soybeans, canola, cereals, and thought they were getting good results. They were doing it with a higher residual product to keep the costs down. That's anecdotal data, but good observations to have. I'm trying to encourage someone to do a more formal study on that. So if there's any researchers watching, that would be a really good project to get into. And also, we did notice some high levels of a few predators of grasshoppers this year. This fly on the upper left that looks a bit like a bumblebee is actually a bee fly. And this species here is the grasshopper bee fly. They will actually follow grasshoppers, watch where they're laying their eggs, lay their eggs next to the grasshopper eggs, and then the bee fly larvae eat the grasshopper eggs. So that's pretty cool. We saw more of those than we normally see. We also saw a lot of black and gray blister beetles, and they belong to a group or genus called Epicauda. And this genus, Epicauda, the young are specialists on grasshopper eggs, meaning that's pretty much all they feed on is grasshopper eggs. Hence, we're seeing a lot more of them in the higher grasshopper year. I had several people call me wondering if these blister beetles were going to be a concern on their canola or their soybeans. And I was trying to encourage them, unless you're seeing a lot of defoliation, these insects do have a good side to them, especially in a grasshopper year with higher grasshopper populations. And also field crickets, we saw a lot of those late in the summer. They're not a grasshopper specialist by any means. They're an omnivore. They feed on lots of things. And aside from tasting good, they are good predators of some insects. They will feed on grasshopper eggs and some insect pupa in the soil. So we were seeing some very heavy populations, and they will potentially dig up grasshopper eggs. But again, to what degree it controls them, hard to know. My guess is probably the bee flies, the blister beetles, the ones that are specialists, do a much better job than the field crickets do. So we do encourage people, whenever you can, try to help keep these around, because they certainly do help with your grasshopper control. And the other thing I just like to mention regarding grasshoppers is that not every grasshopper is a pest grasshopper. I've said that many times, I know at these meetings, but it's worth reinforcing. There's one particular grasshopper that we often see a lot of when we're driving down the country roads. When it flies away, it has black hind wings with a yellowish rim to it, almost looks like a butterfly. So question number 2 is, what species of grasshopper is this? It's one of our non-pest species. And Tammy, once again, you can let me know who our lucky winner is. And if I need
I'm
to
waiting.
give
Ingrid got it.
Oh,
Ingrid got
okay.
it.
Awesome, very good, Ingrid. So yes, this is the Carolina grasshopper. My clue was going to be it's named after East Coast state, but no need for that. So yeah, Carolina grasshopper, they behave a little differently than most of our pest species. On a hot summer day, most grasshoppers like to be in a canopy where there's a bit of shelter or cover. Carolina grasshopper likes to bask on the gravel roads. It's just a behavioral trait of theirs. And as you drive, they fly away and you get this flash of black. But if you're seeing a lot of these, take note when you walk into the field, what you're seeing in the field. You very rarely see many of these in the field. Once you start moving in, it's usually two-striped, maybe migratory, maybe clear wing, depending on the crop. But usually you see very little of the Carolina. So they might seem abundant based on what you see on the roadside, but overall, they're generally not an overly abundant species that's going to do a lot of crop damage. And of course, katydids, the green, almost a solid green, but with very long antenna. So they're called longhorn grasshoppers, long antenna, versus all our pests have short antenna. They're not pests. They never get to levels that will damage crops, and you usually see very little in a field. So going into 2022, I'll give you a little heads up. We did our grasshopper survey in August. We did get some higher counts. We got a lot of lower counts with our roadside counts that we did in our survey. But based on what happened last year, we had good egg laying conditions in August and September. I would encourage people, monitor your field edges and roadsides early in the season. In spite of what our grasshopper survey map may show from August, I think grasshoppers need to be on your list as one that potentially could be a big concern going into next year. So the map I'll be putting out really soon is basically a snapshot of what we saw in August. To me, the full forecast involves more than that survey. It means looking at egg laying conditions, what happened last year. And again, based on all that, grasshoppers do need to be on your radar. Now, a couple insects that were more sporadic in their populations. One was Diamondback Moth, an insect that doesn't overwinter well in the prairies. They get blown in on the winds. It's not a migration like with armyworms and some insects. They get picked up on wind currents. They get blown along. They get dropped in areas. So it's very unpredictable where they're going to show up and in what numbers. So we put up our pheromone-baited traps every year, and we try to monitor. This year, the lucky recipients were more in the eastern part of the province, the eastern region, the interlake, and the eastern part of the central region. And from about mid-July to about mid-August, that's when most of the concerns with Diamondback Moth were occurring. Now, our trapping network, we really didn't see anything that was alarming. We did have some counts, particularly when you get into the eastern region. We did have a few counts in the eastern interlake that broke 100. But honestly, we really don't know what that means. We can look at numbers relative to other areas of the province and say if anyone does have issues, it could be the eastern interlake. But trying to predict what we would call an outbreak is really hard based on this trap data. Southwest certainly had much lower counts overall. I'm not aware of any issues with Diamondback from the southwest or the western part of the province in particular. It was more the east. So the traps did kind of tell us where we might have some higher levels. But again, use this data with caution. It's good relative data, but I would advise people just, the best thing you can do is be looking, shake a few plants, look for larvae, and see what's there. Trying to predict what could happen next year, again, is very tricky. because very few, if any, will survive our winter. We've got anecdotal data that in some winters, a very low population may survive here, but it's probably very little. What happens here will depend more on what blows in from the south, when it blows in, what conditions are like when it arrives, what the natural enemy situation is like, a lot of factors. So basically, keep scouting. Alfalfa weevil, another sporadic insect that can be very localized in its distribution. And this year, the main concerns were more in the east, mainly the eastern and interlake parts of the province. I know some of the people growing alfalfa for their dairy cows has some fairly big issues with alfalfa weevil. A lot of them decided to cut their hay early. There was some insecticide use. I'm aware of a bit of it in the interlake, but a lot of the people were just cutting their alfalfa early. And what that does, you'll notice it's a weevil larva. It doesn't have any true legs. They can't move too far. So when you cut your alfalfa, they can't just move across the road looking for other alfalfa. If there's nothing there, they starve or desiccate essentially. And also by cutting a bit early, you're kind of cutting off when they're going to be doing their damage, preserving some of the alfalfa, reducing the yield loss. Sometimes that's the most economical decision, is just to cut it maybe a little bit earlier than you normally would. As long as you're getting into that early bloom stage, sometimes that's the best way to manage alfalfa weevils. So, and also I'd just like to point out too, with alfalfa weevil, it's usually a first cut problem for the hay growers. Generally, by the time we get into second cut, they're starting to turn into pupa and they're done for the season. But we have had years where, especially some of the cooler summers, where the life cycle is slow enough that you still do get some feeding on the regrowth of that second cut. So we usually tell people, if you are using cutting as your control strategy, just keep an eye on that regrowth. Hopefully you'll be okay. In most cases, you won't have to do anything, but good to keep an eye on that. And ultimately, what keeps alfalfa weevil in check are parasitoids. There's a couple that seem to be particularly good at parasitizing. Bathyplectes, the one on your left, that's the main one that parasitizes alfalfa weevil. And studies were done several years ago. David Osterman and myself, we were collecting alfalfa weevils, and David was rearing them and looking at the parasite levels that popped out of them. And at times you can get some very high levels, especially of this Bathyplectes. And our feeling is that in areas where we were seeing the lower populations, this is probably what's at play, keeping them in check. Okay, aphids, another insect that was more localized in where it was an issue this past year. And just like Diamondback Moth, the aphids that affect small grains do not overwinter well in Manitoba, or likely at all, really. They get blown in from the south. And again, it depends on when they get blown in and where, regarding what pest levels will be like. And we started to notice them in the cereals in about mid-June. And we did have some higher populations that got to economic levels, mainly in the east, central, and southwest regions. And it was mainly late June to about late July when people are noticing the higher levels of aphids in the cereals. Now, some growers had a real hard time trying to decide what to do because they were kind of borderline threshold with the aphids, but they were also noticing a suite of natural enemies in their field. They were noticing a lot of lady beetle larvae. At that time of year, you're seeing less adults, more larvae of lady beetles. They were seeing lacewing larvae. They were seeing these slug-like things up. Now, this picture is on a soybean leaf, but they were seeing these slug-like things up on their wheat heads. And people were kind of baffled. What are these things? Are they damaging the wheat? So that's question
Carly Owen has already answered it.
What? That was super quick.
Carly,
so, okay, well,
show off.
Very good. Yes, I'm pleased that we have an answer so quickly, because this is one that really baffled a lot of people this year. These are hoverfly larvae. And now to give credit to our agronomists, again, I'm glad that people are able to pick this up. I did have several people send me photos of these. And again, very well trained, seasoned agronomists, a bit confused about what these slug-like things were up on the wheat heads feeding. Well, they weren't sure what they were feeding on. These are hoverfly larvae. They're legless. So if you're worried whether it's an armyworm or something, note no legs. They're blind, legless maggots. Usually the hoverfly adults, which look almost like bee and wasp mimics, they lay their eggs where there's aphid colonies. And when the larvae hatch out, they probe around with their heads. They kind of tap around. And when they find an aphid, they impale it with a hook in their mouth part, hold it up, suck the juice out of it, and then put it down and grab another one. And they can be good predators of aphids. So if you're seeing a lot of them on the wheat heads as well, don't panic. That's good. They're eating your aphids. And if anybody's interested in using it, there is a Serial Aphid Manager app that's out. Tyler Wist with AAFC in Saskatoon is the one who developed the app. And it was data from Manitoba and Saskatchewan primarily that went into the development of this app. So it does work with our local populations. It incorporates the stage of the plant, the number of aphids, natural enemies you're seeing. And if you do know your species of aphids, it will fine tune the recommendation based on the species of aphid. It does make you monitor a certain number of plants though before it will spit out a recommendation for you. So if you're wanting to use the app and just look at 3 or 4 plants, it might not get you where you want to, but if you have the patience and you're willing to do enough plants, you'll get your answer. Okay, another insect that needs some coverage this year is Lygus bugs. Wasn't a real bad year in Manitoba, was worse further west in the prairies, but we did have some fields sprayed for Lygus bugs in canola, sunflowers, alfalfa seed, strawberries. It has multiple hosts. And we also had some issues with dry beans being shipped to Europe, where they were finding Lygus damage on some of the seeds, especially the light colored seeds like your navy beans. Lygus can make pits in the seeds if they're feeding on it at the, I guess in this case, the wrong time. So you have to be careful. Dry beans and soybeans are more of a transient host of Lygus bugs. It's not where they want to settle and reproduce, but they will move into it and feed on it as they're moving between crops. So sometimes when you get into the early podding stages, it's good to scout those crops for Lygus as well. But we had a bit of a dilemma this year. Canola was not yielding well, but it was very high priced. And we have some tables for Lygus bug that give the economic thresholds. And people were using those, which is good. But they were trying to extrapolate and say, well, if the table is telling me at $10 canola, here's my threshold, I'll just half that for $20 canola. And you can't do that. The trend with the feeding versus damage is not linear in that fashion. You do get to a point where the Lygus just aren't causing economic damage. So spraying at 1 or 2 Lygus in 10 sweeps is never going to be economical. So a few of us entomologists got together in late July and said, okay, how do we address this? So we decided, Hector Carcamo has actually been doing research for several years trying to revise the Lygus threshold in canola. So, but we decided that maybe it's time that we look at Hector's data, which should be published really soon, and see what that data is recommending for Lygus thresholds. So the new thresholds based on Hector's data and modern canola varieties are 20 to 30 Lygus per 10 sweeps. Under most growing conditions, that should be appropriate. If the canola is drought stressed, struggling, you might want to go as low as about the lower end of that, the 20 per 10 sweeps. Below that, it's probably not going to be economical. The previous thresholds were done decades ago when canola was very different. I could walk through it, no problem. I was usually barely over my knees. Our varieties are very different these days. Hector's been revising the threshold. So this is what we suggest people use going forward for our Lygus bug thresholds. And again, it's the early potting stages that you really need to focus on. The feeding they're doing to buds and flowers could have some impact in a dry year where there's very little compensatory growth, but in most years, the canola can compensate for the bud and flower loss. It's the pod feeding that you really need to focus on. Do your scouting and use the thresholds I just provided. Okay, the new insect that I want to bring to people's attention is an insect in corn called corn rootworm. And we've known for a few years that we have a species called northern corn rootworm. And it's gotten to the point where we have started to see some cornfields where late in the season, you get a heavy wind event and the corn is just being pushed over and it's laying on the ground, very hard to get into and harvest. I went to 2 fields this summer that were both silage fields. I don't know how they were going to harvest them. The corn was basically being pushed right over. It was lying pretty much. So tough to harvest those. In both cases, when you pulled up the roots, there was not much left. They had been damaged by these larvae called corn rootworm. They're a beetle larva. They feed on the roots. And until this year, we thought we only had northern corn rootworm, which can be green or almost a yellow color, but no black stripes. This past year, one of the fields I went into, I was really surprised, amazed, and kind of excited because it was the first time I'd ever seen Western corn rootworm in Manitoba. I did my master's thesis on this beast in Ontario many decades now ago, and hadn't seen one in a long time. So I was, again, surprised, but excited in little ways to see them here. But what this does mean is we know we've got established populations of both species. Populations are building. For anyone who's growing corn on corn on corn on corn on corn, you might want to consider if there's a way you can get another crop in there to rotate. Again, the damaging stage is a larva that hatches out in the spring. It cannot move, and it only feeds on corn. If there is no corn in that field, they die. So the eggs should all be laid in cornfields. No corn, no rootworms, problem gone. So rotation is the way you want to deal with it. So I've got just 2 or 3 minutes left before Tammy comes in and tackles me. So just want to cover a couple of other insects that we're monitoring just to figure out what levels are like and where they are present. Cabbage seedpod weevil, it's been in the province for a few years now, and we've been doing surveys to monitor what levels are like and where it's found. We did find populations as far east as the Gladstone area this year. The good news, the highest counts we were getting was about 1 or 2 in 75 sweeps for our high counts. The threshold is 10 to 25 in 10 sweeps. So bottom line, they are present in Western and making their way into central Manitoba, but the population is still staying well below economic levels. So good news in a way, population is expanding, but it's not rising. They are still at very low levels. And pea leaf weevil for the pulse growers. Same thing, we had traps up early in the season and we were trying to figure out what levels are like and where they're present. The traps are a useful tool, but some of our really valuable information comes from keen agronomists who are out scouting the fields, notice weevils physically present on the plants and send them in. And our first samples back in 2019 came from an agronomist up in the Northwest who sent in some weevils to be verified. They were pea leaf weevil. Until this year, we thought it was just something the Northwest had at, I'll say, low to moderate levels. This year, we did find them in the Southwest and into the central region, but once again, it was keen agronomists who were finding these things. It wasn't in our pheromone beta traps that we put out. It was just keen agronomists observing them, sending them in to be verified, and yes, they were pea leaf weevil. Levels are probably not at the point where I would say they're economical in Manitoba, but they are present. And again, it's just something just like with cabbage seed pod weevil, we'll just have to continue monitoring. So hats off and thank you to the agronomists who were noticing the weevils on the volunteer peas late in the season and sending in their samples. You're doing an awesome job. And for anyone who does come across a kind of a blunt-nosed weevil, about 5 millimeters long on your pulse crops, you can send them in. I'd love to receive samples. What the adults do is make these little notches in the leaves early in the season, and you'll see them late in the season doing the same thing. It's the larvae feeding on the nodules on the roots that are the issue. They don't feed on the roots so much, they feed on the nodules. So you have nodule plants with fewer nodules, so it's more of a nutrient deficiency that this insect is creating. Okay, and so I'm going to end with some things that didn't happen this year because it's always good to end with good news. Soybean aphids, the last
You're
time
only over by a minute so far, John.
Oh no, that's good for me though. Soybean aphid, the last time we had an issue was 2017, so they weren't an issue again. Flax, last problems were 2014, no aphids in them. Corn borer, I had trouble finding them for my study I was trying to do in corn, so I guess that was a good problem. And Bertha armyworm and armyworms were also low this year. So if you need information on these insects, you can go to our website, fact sheets on most of these. And in summary, watch for flea beetles and grasshoppers next year. Levels have been increasing for grasshoppers, and these two in particular you need to watch for. And if you do see cabbage seed pod weevil or pea leaf weevil or western corn rootworm, give me a call, let me know. Be glad to see your samples or take your information. And I'll end with that, and tell me if I have any time left, I can take a question or two if there's any.
You have negative 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Do you feel increased spraying and frequency of spraying insecticides over the last many years for flea beetles has increased the mortality of predators and thus made the problem worse?
Oh boy, that's a good question, and it will be totally speculative. It is possible. It's an unfortunate reality. We don't have a selective spray for flea beetles. Everything we spray is broad spectrum. One thing that I've noticed is sometimes early in the season, there's a really tiny ground beetle called Bembidian. It's black with a couple yellow dots, but they're really tiny running around. There's often lots of them. And my gut feeling is they probably are feeding on some flea beetles, potentially. Nobody's really studied that. Shayla's doing some work on ground beetles and flea beetles. The other thing, though, to note with flea beetles is they're quick insects. They move around a lot. So they're not something that most predators can do a good job consuming. So previous studies have shown that levels of predation at the best of times maybe aren't great with flea beetles. So
that's a very good point. Very interesting. Okay. Is there a residual insecticide that you would recommend to spray on flea beetles?
Oh boy. Short answer is not really. Your options are pyrethroids, carbaryl, which is your 7, malathions registered. I don't think it gets a lot of use. The residual is not really there. So with most people, it's a pyrethroid or carbaryl. I know carbaryl is a more expensive option. Some people are using that. Those are your options. There's a few products that people are testing, but yeah, nothing with I'll say a diamide type residual that we see with some of the diamide products and other pests, not beetles.
Okay. Any comments on thrips in barley? Were you having lots of problems with that you saw? Jeff saw some in the Balder Belmont area.
Yeah, and I didn't mention it in my top 6, but there were some localized problems with thrips in barley. It was mainly barley thrip. We weren't hearing much of it, as much anyway, in wheat and oats. So I'm thinking it was mainly barley thrip. It's something that, again, localized, sporadic. Keep an eye on things as the head starts coming out of the boot. That's the critical period. Once the heads fully emerge, you're too late to do a spray. So scouting there has to be really timely. And especially that southwest, most of the calls I had regarding thrips in barley were that southwest region. So that seemed to be one of the hotter spots.
Thank you, John, for only being 6 minutes over time. I really appreciate that. There is a couple more questions that maybe I'll try to get you to answer in the Q&A if possible.